welcome back. I'm Blaise up at the World Economic Forum with the partner of Boston Consulting Group in Indonesia, Edwin Utama. We're talking about infrastructure. We spoke about planning, implementation, finances. We just started getting into that. We were talking about you, in your case, as you were saying, not differentiating between foreign and domestic investors, but talk a bit about what Indonesia's financial needs are for its infrastructure goals.
So, in terms of the size, there is a massive requirements for infrastructure, at least 250 billion. Some people say maybe even double the requirements in the next 5 years alone. Right? So there will be lots of financing requirement. And most of the government will address the financing requirements by the state budget. But in the case of Indonesia, it's not enough. Right? I think in the past we spent probably around 2.5% of our GDP for infrastructure requirement. But that's really barely sketching the surface, right? So obviously we need to have more financing support. Now recently the government has done well in terms of reducing the fuel subsidy. That provides a breathing room actually, so that the government can provide more funding for the lack of infrastructure and other productive asset. But then again, it's never enough. So you need to involve private from domestic and also from international to contribute to the financing requirement in Indonesia.
Realistically, how much do you think could come from the state itself, budget? What percent of GDP could Indonesia give?
Other countries, like Vietnam, India, and China, some of them actually spend close to 7% or even more of the GDP requirement. Right? So I would say, and Indonesia has to spend at least 5% of the GDP for infrastructure, at least. Because if you want to grow as fast as some of these countries.
And they need privates to match that, to double?
Ideally, or even more. Well, I mean, at the end of the day, we believe that the government role actually has to be minimal in terms of this kind of investment. In fact, we believe that the government role should be doing no harm for the private. Right? So the more a lot of things are coming from the private, the better.
So let's talk about commitments. There are some figures that aren't too encouraging. For example, figures of commitment from China. It's been well below half or even a quarter of commitments have been realized. What are people coming up against, again, developing commitments and actually having them followed through? Does this just fall back to the issues of planning, or is there an issue with Indonesia securing finances more in the first place?
Well, I think it's partly planning, right? I think the government of Indonesia must, first of all, understand what they want and what they need. It's about the type of projects that they are going to put on the table. It's about the kind of financing arrangement that we plan for the project. Is it public-private partnership? Is it fully under the government budget? Is it supported by the state-owned enterprise, for example? So that has to be clear in the beginning, right? And after that, we need to realize how much the government can provide, how much will be the gap should be filled in by, neighboring countries, how much the requirements should be filled in by private. So that has to be actually fully sorted out in the beginning before we go into, to public.
What other issues remain in financing infrastructure projects?
So I think one of the initiatives that the government is thinking at the moment is the creation of the development bank or infrastructure bank. This has a very good idea in our opinion. This has merit. I think what we found out is, relying only on the government and also domestics will not work, especially for infrastructure, because there is a couple of mismatches actually. We have a foreign currency mismatch, as we discussed about. If we 100% rely on the foreign institutions, it will be difficult for them because they are investing in a long period of time, 20 years, and they will not be able to predict how much foreign currency fluctuation that might happen. Domestically, even if there is a lot of companies who want to invest in infrastructure, we are talking about maturity mismatch, especially for the domestic banks. Right? So the money that they get from the consumers, for example, is in the order of a couple of years, whereas infrastructure projects is 20, 30 years sometimes. So there's a mismatch also in maturity. There is an issue also about the specialization. So most financial institutions don't concentrate their assets on infrastructure. They diversify. Right? So having an infrastructure bank, a bank that specializes in infrastructure, makes a lot of sense. Right? So they address the maturity mismatch, they address the foreign currency mismatch, and they will help make sure that there is also specialization in infrastructure. But I think doing this and making this successful is also not easy. We will come back again to the issue of talent, for example. Right? We will come back again to the issue of government commitment, because in the short term, getting multipliers of the government equity, getting development banks to also participate in this infrastructure bank, getting domestic institutions to be able to fund the money for this infrastructure bank will require some kind of government support.
What do you think can happen at events like this, like a World Economic Forum in Jakarta? How do you think events like this can contribute to actually bringing forward successful infrastructure projects in the future? Can they add anything, or is it something that just has to be pursued behind closed doors?
I think it can happen both, and forum like this will help, for example, in strengthening the messages. Some of the points are actually more important than the others, and helping investors emphasize more and more actually the points, that will help a lot.
Let's look at a case in point, the 35,000 megawatt project, the next 5 years. It's a huge thing, highly ambitious, which is meant to affect everything else. Do you think that's feasible in a 5-year period to make 35,000 megawatts added to the national grid?
Honestly, I think it's very tough. Right? I think in the past the government also has similar programs, 10,000 for example, and that hasn't really materialized in the country. But then again, it's mostly about implementation. Going back to planning, managing, and also optimization of the asset.
Okay. Edwin, thank you so much for joining us.
No worries, thank you.
Pleasure.
Good to see you.
Right. We'll be seeing you again in just a short while at the World Economic Forum here in Jakarta. Take care.